Welcome to Raw Data. I'm Leslie Chang.
And I'm Mike Osborne. Today's episode is part 3 in our series on the origins of power in Silicon Valley. Today, Silicon Valley is famous for being a place with a lot of utopian ideas. But where did those ideas come from? A lot of the Valley's ideology goes back to the 1960s. The Bay Area was an epicenter of the counterculture. But the counterculture itself was actually a lot more complicated than you may think. And if you look back to the people who were here during the 1960s, you can trace the origins of a very specific worldview that now defines Silicon Valley.
But before we get to what happened in the 60s, let's back up. In our last episode, we told the story of how military spending in the 50s fueled the creation of the tech industry in the Valley. In the early days of the Cold War, this place was all about producing miniaturized electronics like transistors and microchips, things that went into rockets, missiles, and satellites. And for a while, everyone was on board with that.
But as the Vietnam War ramped up, all of that was about to change.
It meant one thing to do military-industrial research in the 40s and 50s, when we had just ended World War II and saved the world from fascism. It meant something quite different when we became a neo-colonial power responsible for the deaths of 3 million Vietnamese.
This is historian Fred Turner. Fred's book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, is a deep investigation into the roots of modern Silicon Valley culture. Fred points out that in America, computers were initially created as weapons of war to defeat the Nazis, and then later to beat back the communists, the Red Menace.
But in the 1960s, as Americans slowly turned against the Vietnam War, computers lost their heroic sheen.
Throughout Vietnam, people suspect computers particularly.
They came to be seen as cruel, dehumanizing instruments of military bureaucracy.
The most obvious machinery of war, such as, and I think it is a good target, that computation center.
Computers were the enemy throughout the 1960s.
At one rally in 1964 at Berkeley, protesters wore IBM punch cards around their necks, as if to say, damn it, we are not just data points in your machine. The protests specifically called out the evils of technology. In later protests, UC students even burned their punch cards, just like they burned Vietnam draft cards.
Remember, a lot of university research labs were running on military dollars, so students were protesting against the war and against the presence of defense spending on college campuses.
Journalist John Markoff, who reported on Silicon Valley for decades, wrote about this tumultuous period in his book, What the Dormouse Said.
Yeah, all over the country in the 60s, the growing anti-war movement would focus on the relationship that the campus had with the war machine.
The killing is done right here in this university. Right here.
Students were protesting here at Stanford, too.
You gotta put something on the line if you want to get something done.
In 1969, they organized a famous demonstration called the April 3rd movement.
A group of students and non-students were continuing their protest against the university's war-connected research. Early this morning, police were called by school president...
And the April 3rd movement was sparked in large degree by the discovery by the students that Stanford, as an institution that was supposed to be an institution of learning, was in fact contracting with the Pentagon to do classified research to help the military in Vietnam.
The atmosphere seemed to dominate here at Stanford during the first day of the April 3rd movement's two-day boycott of classes.
In specific, a graduate student at Stanford found a computer printout in the computer center that was a simulation for helicopter helicopter missions being flown in Vietnam.
Okay, we're at the computer center, and it appears to be surrounded.
Stanford trustees for their positions on war-related research being carried on at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute.
But the point is that the killing is being done right here on this campus.
A week of mass demonstrations in April of 1969 and led to, one of those classic confrontations between the students and the demonstrators and the police and tear gas.
It'll be better.
Roll your eyes back and forth.
Oh, shit.
Stop and think about this for a second. If you were to go back to the Bay Area of the late 60s with all of these protests against technology, you'd probably think this would be the last place in the world to become the center of the modern tech industry. So how did we get from protesters wearing punch cards around their necks to the unashamed techno-utopianism of modern-day Silicon Valley?
If you follow this part of the history carefully, it explains so much about the ideology that exists here today. When you think of the hippies and the counterculture, you tend to think of it as one big group: pro-civil rights, anti-Vietnam, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But according to Fred Turner, it's actually a specific subgroup of the counterculture that really shaped the mentality of what would become Silicon Valley.
This subgroup, this faction of hippies, was inspired by a few key people. One of their biggest heroes was a mathematician named Norbert Wiener. His story starts back in World War II.
I doubt that there is a person in the audience who does not know of Dr. Wiener.
Is this about the right distance? Oh, this is it. I, in the first place, now feel the high point of the evening has been reached, and I shall now take care of its gradual decline.
Norbert Wiener was a math professor at MIT, and like a lot of other scientists, he was recruited to join the war effort. Wiener was working on a very specific problem.
Interested. I tried to see if I could find some niche in the war effort at that time.
The problem was, how do we shoot down airplanes, particularly Japanese airplanes? The pilots can make them wiggle all around. The gunner has to shoot ahead of them, but they can't predict where they're going, so they invariably miss, and this is a real problem.
The survival of anybody to combat with Germany seemed to depend on anti-aircraft defense.
So Norbert Wiener got assigned to this problem, and what he did that was so smart was he imagined the plane, the pilot, the anti-aircraft gun on the ground, and the anti-aircraft gunner as all elements in a single information system. He imagined them all as essentially mathematically modelable actors in a system.
So Wiener reduces each of these actors to data points, interacting in one unified system. This simplifies the math of this particular problem. But Fred says it also opened Wiener's eyes to an even more profound conclusion.
The actual fire control is a system involving human beings and machines at the same time, and must be reduced from an engineering point of view to a single structure, which either means a human interpretation of the machine or a mechanical interpretation of the operator, or both.
He was able to find a way to think about machines and people in the same language. So suddenly the organic human body of the gunner and the mechanical body of the gun in the airplane are the same kind of thing. If these things are in fact the same kind of thing, and we can argue about whether they are or aren't, but if they are, then the machines that we use to manage information, computers, and the techniques we use on them, algorithms, calculations, computation, are the proper mechanisms of governance for not just machines, but also people.
This leads Wiener to start thinking about turning everything into mathematical models. Now, maybe this doesn't seem like such a big idea. After all, today, we're used to seeing the world through the lens of data. But at the time, this was a brand new way of thinking. Norbert Wiener believed that perhaps there was no limit to what kinds of things could be quantified, datafied, and digitized. He ended up crystallizing all of these ideas into a new conceptual framework. He called it cybernetics.
And I chose the name from the Greek word kybernetes, meaning steersman, as essentially the art of the steersman.
In the 50s and 60s, cybernetics was seen as the universal discipline across the social sciences, across the biological sciences, systems theory, across management theory. It was seen as a kind of, finally, we've discovered the universal truth. The 1950s is a period when social scientists of all kinds believed that the world itself is literally a system of communication, a system of information systems interacting with one another.
Even though Norbert Wiener had founded cybernetics as an offshoot of his wartime research, he was later appalled by the atomic bomb. He became a pacifist and a prominent spokesperson warning about the risks of militarized science.
If we want to live with the machine, we must understand the machine. We must not worship the machine. We must make a great many changes in the way we live with other people. We shall have to realize that while we may make the machines our gods and sacrifice men to machines, we do not have to do so. And if we do so, we deserve the punishment of idolaters.
Regardless, cybernetics was out there, and people took from it what they wanted to.
Norbert Wiener and his idea of cybernetics have created a vision of the world that is harmonious, leveled, collaborative, and interlinked by information. All of those ideas become central to the counterculture and to the hippie movement that follows.
And the guy who brought Norbert Wiener and cybernetics to the counterculture was a man named Stewart Brand.
Stewart went to Stanford in the 50s, which is where he first encountered cybernetics. For Stewart, cybernetics revealed the underlying unity of everything in the universe. It was mind-blowing.
After Stewart graduated, he spent a couple years in the military. But by the early 60s, he had found his way back to the Bay Area. There was something going on here, drawing him back.
Imagine San Francisco in the mid-1960s. You're 3,000 miles away from New York, Chicago, you're 2,000 from Chicago. You're on the outer edge of the earth. Air travel is not yet super common. It's kind of expensive. People come here a lot by train. We've always been the place for gold rushes, for weird sailors to come through. We're a place that allows for and celebrates experiments.
Before too long, Stewart starts hanging out with this group of people who call themselves the Merry Pranksters. They're led by Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Because do you know what we have here? We have an army, a Nirvana army. An army all around, but they don't hup to the old new tunes. And they know they're an army, and we know it. But we don't know exactly what direction we're marching. And we can't say because we don't know it all.
The Merry Pranksters would throw these parties where they took acid and listened to music, put on light shows.
Let's send me to the moon. Me to the moon.
The parties were called acid tests. Stewart became a regular.
He became sort of the intellectual member of the Merry Pranksters. He was one of the people who hung out with Ken Kesey, who of course had been here.
This is John Markoff again. He's currently working on a biography of Stewart Brand.
Stewart had been involved in LSD very early.
The tickets to another world. Sugar cubes impregnated with LSD, a research chemical with strange and still many unknown effects. Out of the laboratory, bought on the black market. It allows its users to plunge through the depths of their unconscious, to take a trip.
You know, my sense is that for people in the 60s, the kinds of experiences that LSD brings, experiences of a lack of distinction between you and the world around you, the sense that things are interconnected by energetic systems, hallucinations that present things melting into other things. That vision of a world that was universally interconnected somehow was historically super resonant for that generation. And the reason I think it was resonant was not actually because of properties internal to LSD. Rather, I think LSD created a kind of psychological experience that mirrored a series of understandings that were already emerging in the world.
Dropping acid was like experiencing cybernetics right in front of your eyes. You were seeing for yourself how the world was interconnected and linked.
Around this time, the Haight-Ashbury scene was starting to take shape. In 1966, Stewart helped organize a huge 3-day extravaganza called the Trips Festival. He got several bands to play, including the Grateful Dead.
10,000 hippies showed up, and for the first time they realized that there were 10,000 hippies. It created a community. They didn't know that they all thought they were the only ones out there, and they came together and they realized there are a heck of a lot of us. That led directly to the scene in the Haight.
In the mid-1960s, we become a place where, particularly in the Haight, people who had known the beat movement or had come from other places begin to imagine alternative ways of living. They begin to live communally.
Young people are questioning the rules of society, the establishment. Some of them are taking to the streets, protesting against Vietnam and against Jim Crow, trying to steer politics and society in a different direction.
But there's another faction of the counterculture that is fed up with society and has no interest in working within the existing system. This faction starts imagining how they might build their own new societies.
Between 1966 and 1973 was the largest wave of commune building in American history. Depending on your source, as many as 1 million Americans headed back to the land during that period and built alternative communities.
Million?
As many as 1 million. That's the most extreme source. The more likely one is several 100,000.
Communes are popping up all over the place, energized by utopian dreams.
The way the saying went at the time, it's like, if we can just get our heads together, we can build a better society. What they want to do is leave politics behind and build communities centered around the sharing of consciousness.
Let me ask you really quick, by shared consciousness, like how would they have defined that? That sounds like a weird, like culty groupthink thing.
Oh,
just to play devil's advocate, like what did they really mean by that?
Well, so it's a really important question, because on a lot of communes, what shared consciousness meant varied a lot by the communes in play. The first thing I think was a sense of a broadly shared orientation toward the natural and the material world. What was that orientation? It was an orientation that says the world around us is connected by invisible interlinkings. Those might be informational, which is why they were so drawn to computers and cybernetics, or they might be energetic, or they might be just vibes, right? Just vibes.
Energy. Yeah.
Energy, right? That kind of loose, non-spoken energy. Now, what's fascinating, right, is in the energetic space, what happens is that when you take away law...
But this whole new society thing is still pretty vague. So as Stewart is watching the commune movement grow, he's realizing that these people need some help. They need to get organized. They need tools that will make the commune movement actually work.
And he and his wife, Lois, say, look, this commune movement is happening. How can we help them? I bet they need tools as they head back to the land. So they got in a truck.
Stewart and his wife, Lois, started driving from commune to commune, asking people, what tools do you need to make this work? Fred told us about one commune they visited called Drop City. It's out on the high plains of Colorado.
Wild geodesic domes. The domes are made of different colored chunks of car roofs tacked together to make little triangles all attached, and it becomes something like a giant space colony set out in the middle of a kind of desert flatland. The people themselves, they're wearing ragged jeans, they're going shirtless, some of them are naked because they want to get closer to the earth. They see themselves as artists, and so they often are wearing very creative clothing, things in their hair, bandanas, tie-dye. And as the commune goes along, they start to have these scruffy little children who are running around as well. Not a lot of haircutting going on.
You might imagine commune life as being sort of organic. Get back to nature. Let's get our hands dirty in the soil. Kind of anti-technology. But according to Fred, the commune builders actually embraced technology, though in a very specific way. They developed a new philosophy of technology that was personalized, individual, and could unshackle them from societal strife.
They believed very much that small-scale technologies like music systems and like LSD particularly could be tools through which they could begin to achieve a kind of synchronized mindset.
On their road trip, Stewart and Lois Brand soaked this all in, and when they got home, they wrote up everything they'd learned.
They put together about a 60-page list, a mimeograph list of things that people might want, came back to Menlo Park, here just at the edge of the Stanford campus, and they began printing up a catalog.
In 1968, Stewart publishes the first edition of the Whole Earth Catalog. The catalog gets its name from the first photo taken by NASA from space of the entire Earth. And in fact, Stewart Brand is responsible for that photo. Back in 1964, Stewart was coming down from an acid trip, and he found himself on the roof of a building in San Francisco, looking down on the city lights, and wondering why no one had ever seen a picture of the entire globe. So he set out to get one, lobbying NASA to take a picture and release it. That photo is on the cover of the Whole Earth Catalog.
The Whole Earth Catalog was this unique publication. It was kind of like a magazine. Technically, it was a catalog, although you couldn't actually buy anything from it directly. It wasn't mail order. It's kind of hard to describe. So I went with our producer, Jackson, to Stanford Library's special collections to see a physical copy of the catalog.
So, is there anyone else that we need?
No,
just you guys?
This is Tim Noakes. He's a librarian, and he works in special collections.
Do you know anything about the Whole Earth Catalog?
And if you don't, that's okay, but we just figured we'd ask just in case.
It's very popular. This is a very rare item that actually is very difficult to find, the 1968 Whole Earth Catalog. It's fascinating. I think you'll enjoy it.
Tim laid out the catalog on a wooden table for us.
It's black background, and there's an image of the Earth, and it says Whole Earth Catalog, Access to Tools is the subtitle. Fall 1968, and it cost $5 at the time.
The table of contents is understanding whole systems and shelter and land use, industry and craft, communications, community, nomadics, and learning.
The catalog is 80% books. The catalog is not really about tools for building or plowing, though there are references to those kinds of things. It's much more about creating a shared mindset and revealing the hidden order of the universe.
We built our own computers. I wonder if that's a book or something.
The human biocomputer, the mind of the dolphin,
encyclopedia of space,
cybernetics, eye and brain,
the human use of human beings is the
man-machine systems interactions.
Ooh, Geology Illustrated. Should sportsmen take dope? A new technique for using your subconscious power by Maxwell Maltz, MD, FICS.
On the inside cover of every edition of the Whole Earth Catalog, there's a manifesto. It's a mission statement of what the catalog is supposed to do.
This is what he said. We are as gods and might as well get good at it. So far,
remotely done power and glory as via government, big business, formal education, church, has succeeded to the point where gross defects obscure actual gains. In response to this dilemma, and to these gains, a realm of intimate, personal power is developing. Power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth Catalog.
The catalog is built around a view of the world in which you are alone, in which you are surrounded by resources. You need to choose those resources and put your own life together on that basis. It's a very libertarian idea. And it's an idea, I think, that animates the builders and designers of information systems today. It's a way of looking at the world. And to empower a user in that world means to give them tools to empower themselves.
Stewart sold 1,000 copies of the first edition. Just a few years later, more than 2 million copies had sold. Here's journalist John Markoff again.
In doing this research on Stewart, I can't tell you how many people I run into who, when I tell them, oh yeah, he created the Whole Earth Catalog, they go, oh yeah, the Whole Earth Catalog changed my life.
One person in particular whose life was changed by the Whole Earth Catalog was a man named Kevin Kelly.
Do you remember where you were when you first saw the Whole Earth Catalog? Do you remember, what you saw or why it resonated with you?
I remember very, very clearly. I was standing in a bookshop in Woodstock, New York, and I came across this thing on a table, and it opened up, and it was like instant. A bell had been rung inside of me. It was just like I was like vibrating. It was like, this is me. This is for me. This was written exactly for me, and I couldn't wait to read it. I literally read cover to cover. I almost memorized it.
Kevin Kelly would later become the founding editor of Wired magazine. We'll hear more about his story later in the series. But Kevin first moved out to California in the early 70s to work for Stewart, in part because he was so inspired by the catalog.
And after that moment, it sort of became a huge factor in my life in terms of giving me permission to invent it.
Permission to invent your life?
Yeah. I think that that's the message I took away, which was that a lifestyle or a life was something that you created rather than inherited or accepted or got, and that this was the catalog of possibilities, and that here were all these things that you could do or be, and here, by the way, are some tools to make it happen. And it was like, oh, I get to invent what I'm going to do.
That was the power of that idea of the counterculture, that the Whole Earth catalog became the Bible of. It was, access to tools for individuals. Mm-hmm. And the computer was a specific example of that, but it was broader. I mean, whether you were an architect or whether you were a contractor or whatever, it was a way of looking at the world. We don't need these big institutions. We can build these institutions from the bottom up and recreate society. And it was about transformation, always. Yeah. Changing the world is the way Silicon Valley came to call it.
In 1971, the Whole Earth Catalog won the National Book Award.
But meanwhile, out on the communes, things were not going so well. Building a brand new society isn't easy.
When the commune folks set up in the late 60s, they thought that it would be enough just to share a mindset, to share consciousness, to be with people like themselves. They thought that bureaucracy and rules were exactly the problem and politics was the problem. They tried to do away with those. Well, it turns out that when you do away with politics and rulemaking, you take away all of your ability to negotiate the distribution of resources. And instead of that ability, you start to have charismatic leaders emerging. You start to have rule by cool, where whoever's coolest gets to govern. That's not a good way to go, because what it does is it allows old prejudices to bubble back up. So the communes very quickly become racially segregated. They become places where women are treated much worse than men.
By 1972, the commune movement was disintegrating. People were packing up and heading home. This grand experiment, it didn't work.
We hit the 70s, and frankly, Stewart Brand is a little bit lost. And all of his friends are a little bit lost. They had tried to build a revolution, and it kind of faded away.
Stewart Brand decided to stop publishing the Whole Earth Catalog. But, by all accounts, he loves a good ceremony, so he staged a funeral for the catalog. He called the event the Demise Party, and he hosted it at the San Francisco Exploratorium in 1971. 1,500 people showed up.
He brought these folks together, and he stood on the stage in a black monk's robe saying, okay, here's $25,000 from our efforts. You will decide here tonight how to use it. He crowdsourced the distribution of this money. And there were lots of ideas. He wrote them down on a board. He talked with people. It got to be the next day, and eventually one guy ended up walking away with about $15,000.
That guy's name was Fred Moore. And just a few years later, Fred Moore would go on to start the Homebrew Computer Club. The Homebrew Computer Club became an important gathering spot for early computer tinkerers. More on that later in the season.
The Whole Earth catalog ran its course, but the culture and the way of thinking lived on. Not everybody actually went and lived on a commune, but the dream of the commune, the idealism, the spirit of the Whole Earth catalog, all that was still in the air during the 1970s when Silicon Valley came of age. As one example that testifies to the catalog's legacy, here's Steve Jobs giving his famous commencement speech at Stanford in 2005.
When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stewart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic, overflowing with neat tools and great notions. Stewart and his team put out several issues of the Whole Earth catalog, and then, when it had run its course, they put out a final issue. It was the mid-1970s, and I was your age. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
The Whole Earth catalog and the community it inspired carried a new vision of freedom, a philosophy of individual empowerment.
And while the communes were idealistic, maybe the fact that they disintegrated into racist and misogynistic subcultures devoid of rules stands as a warning. Technologies that emphasize individualism come at a cost.
Whole Earth utopianism inspired the people who would later rule Silicon Valley. And according to Fred Turner, one of the lasting legacies of Stewart Brand's Whole Earth catalog was that it brought cybernetics to Silicon Valley.
The other thing that Norbert Wiener's cybernetics offered was a vision of a managed universe. What should government be? Well, in Wiener's imagination, government at some level should be a group of people sitting around computers looking at data, managing data, and sending signals back out into the world, giving it feedback so that it can self-correct, so that it can make itself better, and making itself better be better for all.
The idea that algorithms help us make better decisions, that's very much a cybernetics way of thinking.
And it's this logic that we see all through Silicon Valley today. This is very much the logic of Facebook. This is very much the logic of Google. This is very much the logic of Twitter. You are independent. You should act and react in relation to information signals that are managed for you from far away.
Well, and the world is data.
The world is data. That's right. The fundamental insight is that the world is data.
On the one hand, the core idea of the Whole Earth catalog is that technology can be used to help empower individuals. Tech companies today draw on this rhetoric all the time, and this narrative appeals to our desire for greater freedom. On the other hand,
if the world is all information systems, those who can build and maintain information systems should govern the world.
The philosophy of the Whole Earth catalog underpins the devices and the digital products embedded in our lives today. Silicon Valley would create a whole new society, and you're living in it. But how exactly did Silicon Valley build that new world? How did they actually turn this vision into a reality? It might all come down to one small thing: the screen.
On the next Raw Data.
The fact that I'm going to come to you mostly through this medium here.
He looked at this and he realized that they were somehow getting a dot to move on a screen.
The Atari video computer system is 20 cartridges with 1,300 game variations you play on your own TV set. Don't just watch television tonight, play it.
Computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive.
Apple Computer, the epitome of the American dream.
The Raw Data team is Mike Osborne, Jackson Roach, Isha Salian, and me, Leslie Chang. Our next episode will drop in a week. Be sure to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're interested in Silicon Valley history, Fred Turner's book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, is a must-read. His more recent book, The Democratic Surround, is also excellent.
Journalist John Markoff has written many books about Silicon Valley. We recommend What the Dormouse Said. And keep an eye out for his forthcoming biography of Stewart Brand.
Thank you to Allison Burke of the Stanford Cyber Initiative and to the whole Worldview team for their support and help.
Thanks also to Tim Noakes of Stanford Special Collections. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Raw Data Podcast. Our website is rawdatapodcast.com. There you can find all our past episodes as well as some blog posts. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back in a week.